All right. So we're going to come back to the ethics discussion we had a moment ago and instead do this as a panel for a moment. So I'm going to welcome our panel up here on stage. You know who you are. Without any further ado, feel free to just come up here. So we're going to make sure. So we have some rules. We got to stand above that black line there, or whatever the tape is. So please grab the mic there, and then let's see. We got Danila there on the end. All right, cool. So
above this.
You've met all our speakers at some point or another during the day, so we're going to jump right in. And the topic of this discussion is ethics in AI and ethical AI. So I guess I'm a kind of practical person. I'm an engineer, and I tend to like writing software and selling things that I know what they are. So I'm trying to figure out where ethics comes into my life on a daily basis. And it seems to me that an interesting thing that happened recently that has some ethical consequences is the Boeing incident, where large companies, through some interesting process, suddenly forget that they need airplanes that fly, right? Something along those lines. It seems like a boiling frog problem. So I guess my question is, to the extent that ethics comes up in day-to-day discussions, what are your sort of thoughts and ideas on how you can make sure that you're not being this frog that just slowly boils in an ocean of bad decisions? It's a tough one, so I figured we'd start with the hard ones. Any takers?
Okay, maybe I'll start. So I'm not really sure. So I think one thing you can do that seems really important is to sort of increase openness. So to make sure that the public or to make sure that sort of others might look at and sort of be able to scrutinize your work, etc. And so maybe they can sort of notice if sort of the temperature is sort of going up in your little kettle. I think the other thing you can do would be sort of similar to how you would deal with sort of security issues more generally. So we have like other spaces where people are trying to deal with these sort of like security issues. I don't know, maybe like nuclear power plants are a good example. And they seem to be at least fairly okay, fairly good at figuring out how do you avoid these kinds of accidents. And so maybe like lessons from there are things that we need to sort of bring into, for example, like when you're designing airplanes.
What do you think, Danila?
I was avoiding this question. I was really leaving the microphone for somebody else for this question.
But you work with data sets.
Yes.
So the reason I bring it up this way is that it seems like people are not intentionally usually trying to hurt others. It's just a sequence of decisions that sort of aggregate to a bad situation. So can you tell in your day-to-day sort of when you are facing these bias situations?
Yes. So since I imagine that when we are creating a machine learning model, then we start from collecting data, and then we create a data set, right? So it's from the very beginning, and as you said, there are many steps in which we have really to be careful. I would say that there is even a previous step that we have to keep into mind, which is to discuss within the team about the consequences, the goals of what we want to achieve and what we want to avoid to create any kind of bias. So depending on the domain, depending on every task you are about to work with, so you set your goals, and from that moment there can be a bias in the sources you're using, and you have to select carefully. Then there is a problem if you're doing something, it's supervised model, right? Then the definition itself can be biased. You really want to discuss it. And the annotators, if you need labels, can be biased. And the way then your data set looks, and why not the algorithm itself. So you just described, the problem that I think we should be very careful about is to be aware that bias can occur and can harm, as you say, at any time. So as long as we are aware and we discuss. But the solution, that's another problem.
so it seems like, turning back to your talk earlier about regulatory things, like what are concrete measures you could put in that you've seen in your work with governance on making sure someone asks these questions? Because I feel like a lot of engineers, without any bad intention, just like fail at this and are just going with the flow a lot, right?
Well, that's a very good question. So the first thing I think is important to understand is what are the problems. So we're not just simply talking about bias, because what we said before, bias in itself is not a negative thing. It's where bias get entrenched, and so entrenched that they become stereotypes. And that's the problem, because then this is what artificial intelligence does, because we use it, so and then it'll scale up things that are already in society. So, and a lot of people say to me, well, you know, human beings are biased themselves. What's the problem then? Well, you can challenge a human being. The problem with artificial intelligence, and then you scale it up, and then especially if it's unaccountable. So I always say that there are a number of steps. The first one is to recognize the problem, as was said before. So recognize it. Also, who is involved in the decision making around, for example, which training data you use, how you're going to do the testing processes, how you evaluate the outcome, who is involved in that decision. Actually, and I'm going to say this brutally, if it's 5 white men in the room deciding all that, they're not going, sorry, but they're not going to say, okay, there might be bias coming against the black women. This is the nature of things. This is why diversity in the field is so important. Because diversity in the field is what allows us to understand where potential discrimination, unfairness may come from. So diversity is crucial. The second is, you are crucial in this process, but why don't you think of, for example, who is going to review the decisions that you've made? And that's where the governance is important. So, for example, if I've got a background in the financial sector, you can say, well, why don't we introduce a 3-line of defense, for example, whether you have the coders, the programmers first, then you have somebody reviewing this decision, the decisions made, which is, for example, coming from the legal, from the HR team, from procurement, across different teams of the organization. And then, why don't you involve the users, the consumers? And the problem is going to arise later on, once we start to introduce values into the machine. Because once we start to introduce values into the machine, the big question is, excuse me, who's going to decide these values? Again, is it going to be 5 men in a room, or is it going to be values representing our society?
But it seems like part of the challenge there is that, like, from a practical standpoint, again, like I'm trying to counterweigh the general abstractness of ethics in the sense that, like, what am I supposed to do about that? It's not like I can immediately hire lots of black women to do machine learning here, because there are like none.
Obviously,
almost.
that is a fair point. And in fact, we are talking about cultural challenge here, that we need to make sure that more and more women get, and from every background and every even social background, get into the profession. And this is a challenge that we have to embrace all together. And for example, I mean, talking to schools and you know, this is something that we have to do together. I mean, as we were talking about China before, one thing that really struck me when I was at the UNESCO not long ago, and there was this guy coming from China, and he's the one heading up the AI strategy for China. What was really fascinating, he was showing us a book that they give to children at nursery age. So we're talking about 2-year-old. And in these books, they basically teaching young children that there won't be what they can do in the future. So everything is about, you know, different professions and stuff like that. Of course, there's not a profession about being a train driver, because what they're saying is there ain't going to be any train drivers in 20 years' time. But the thing is, they're showing children, boys and girls, what they can do in the future. Now, China's got a sort of dystopian future in itself in terms of the use of data and all that. But this is something that we could learn from, for example, in terms of having, in terms of practical steps for you and for all of you in this room, is really to have a think, stop and think. Whatever you're doing, say, where may the bias come from? If you don't have enough resources inside your team, ask outside and say, I'm producing this. Is it possible that by doing that, I'm introducing by default some stereotyping?
So,
is it just ask other people?
So I was gonna. So Mikio, you build a retail platform at Zalando. So
not personally, but yes.
Sure. I mean, the company does. So when we talk about these sort of mechanisms that you can put in place to inject some afterthought, sort of, it seems like that's part of the purpose here. Is like we want to make sure that there are points in the process where we force people to actually take a step back and think. I guess, yeah, or yeah, thinking ahead, right. You're right. But my point is, like, you described how you put these things in production, and it seems like when you look at it from a technical standpoint, those things are always missing, right? Like, those are not sort of components in the system. They are something that's on top and around. Do you have any of that built in or, like, part of your process?
No, I think that's what I talked about in the very beginning, right? I think the question is should always think about, okay, how is it used and how could it affect people? And then a very important question is, so what is actually the metric? How will you measure how well what the machine learning model does, right? And I think that's the point where you have to think about, is the way that you evaluate it, could that lead to a way that you're doing like the wrong thing to some people, but you're not actually seeing it, right? Let's say because there's a minority in there, but you're looking at the mean, and the minority doesn't really affect.
So do you have like practical steps in your way of working to counteract that issue, or?
Yeah, I think in principle in this whole, so when you start working on the product, right, so the product has to define what is the customer problem and what does success mean, and at that point you would sort of think about, right, what is it, how would it affect the customer and what do we really want, and then at that point you could at least make sure that the way you evaluate it, make sure that you don't like accidentally even bias against certain things or do the wrong thing, yeah. So by the way, it's interesting that you mentioned the nuclear power platforms, because so when I started doing AI research, right, this was really at a time when it was really just about AI and understanding the human mind, and I would always joke that at least I don't have to work on like nuclear power plant control or something. But now it seems that sort of time is caught up with me.
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to 3 Mile Island anytime soon, but maybe it should. Maybe we should have a close call. That's not too bad. Then it's going to put some fire under people. But so I wanted to sort of, because from my perspective, what seems to be, again, like the big problem here is that we're dealing with something quite subtle. Data is sort of abstract and subtle to most people. You can't really quantify it as a layman usually, exactly what is quality and what is sort of bias and so forth. So do you think, and I guess this is a political question to some extent, but like, do you think companies themselves can govern this, or how? Because if you apply government intervention in this, it's again this like delicate balance between going in there with a hammer versus with a scalpel, where defining quality and bias and all these things in data is like really hard, even for us doing it every day, all day. How would a government official be able to go in and do that effectively? That seems to be a challenge, right? What do you think, Markus?
Yeah, I think I'd agree that like, it seems really, really difficult. At least if you think about, it depends on the kinds of bias you're talking about. If you're talking about things like, make sure if you're doing sort of you're supposed to be able to like tag your friends, etc. Or if you're supposed to be tagging animals, etc. Just like having representative data sets, those kinds of things. They seem like quite simple sort of solutions technically, and we can sort of like do some policy there. But if we're ending up in sort of issues to do with like, so some of the issues that sort of get brought up when it comes to sort of bias in algorithms, etc., they're about like quite deep, difficult sort of philosophical or ethical issues about like what does like justice mean, and with those kinds of things, I think we should like be quite careful in terms of both. It seems right that it's going to be difficult for companies to do that, but it's also right that I think it's going to be really difficult for policymakers to do that. They might be the best placed to sort of like make those judgment calls about like what justice is, but I fear that if they start making those judgment calls without sort of knowing the technology very well, for example, that we might end up sort of doing some like clumsy legislation.
Like we're sort of, I think we all agree in this room that we need ethical AI. Like that's not the issue. It's more the practical implementation and making sure that it aligns in a reasonable way with what other incentives are. So, yeah.
I don't think it's actually too difficult.
Okay.
Yeah? I don't think it's actually too difficult. First of all, we've got plenty of legislation out there already. Yeah? we've got plenty. People operating in the financial sector, they've got legislation there. People operating in medical sector, there's plenty of legislation governing the medical. That's the first thing. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily, right? The second thing is pharmaceutical sector, environment, all technologies and all sector of our society has been regulated. The fact that the pharmaceutical sector has been regulated doesn't mean that the pharmaceutical sector hasn't been thriving and hasn't been innovating. So the people that say, well, you know, innovation can stifle, regulation can stifle innovation, well, that's not the case. It hasn't happened in the past. You know, in the past, we've seen the pharmaceutical sector creating great innovation whilst at the same time being regulated. Before you put a new drug into the market, it has to go through some forms of rigor and control. Right?
Right. To be clear, I'm not saying that like you shouldn't
no,
regulate.
I agree.
Right?
With, no. I'm just saying it's not that difficult because third thing I wanted to say is you can't regulate artificial intelligence in health in the same way that you would regulate artificial intelligence
but let me be
in
the
finance.
devil's attorney for a moment then.
Yeah.
So kind of, I mean, so let's say that's the case. How many startups are you seeing in pharmaceutical space? Like, there's currently an enormous ambition around creating these things through technology, and I think there's a resistance to all of this because everyone sort of knows it's going to slow us a lot down.
Yeah, but
right?
you wouldn't put a new drug in
it's
the
probably
market.
fine. We should be slowed down to a large extent, but it's what is going to happen, right?
But you wouldn't put a new drug in the market if you haven't tested it first.
No,
because
for
you
good
would kill
reason.
people. Yeah, for a good reason.
Yep.
So in what I'm trying to say is that there are agile way of doing this.
Yep.
For example, the GDPR, introduces an Article 42, something called certifications, right? So I'm wondering whether, for example, different trade bodies, so in energy, in health, in pharmaceutical, whether at sector level, organizations can develop standards, and codes at sector level, and then say, if you, as an organization, as a business, deploy artificial intelligence and you do it in a way which complies with that, then you can, to an extent, have a trust mark, a kite mark, or something that demonstrates that you've gone through some process. Because the issue is, I said this morning, but the problem is, I don't want to go on a plane and be able to say, okay, go and inspect it. I can't. I haven't got the tools. What I want to know is that that particular airplane is being vetted by somebody with the right knowledge who can tell me whether I can fly or not.
So so I mean, I think we agree. So I wanted to ask you, Danila. So
I had something more to add.
Go ahead, please.
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Because you mentioned that it's very hard to deal with the data and make sure that the bias is not there. And I agree. I mean, probably in the medical sector, then that must be really, really hard. But I don't deal with that. But I still think that it's also about the effort that we want to make to be sure that there is no bias in there. I don't think it's that impossible, actually. There can be so many practical ways. The point is they take time, so they take probably profit away. But
right. So that's what I wanted to ask you is like
okay.
I have some idea of the working environment in terms of sort of the urgency of getting things out in a young company, and it's sort of don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And if you're coming back and saying, all right, so this is going to have to cost 50% more because we can't afford the bias in this data set because it might have adversarial impact, how do you convince people it's worth it? Because that seems like a tough discussion at this point in time.
Well, in an ideal scenario for me, I wouldn't need to convince people, because if we make more and more people aware of the problem and that the fact that it's important to address it, then there will be a normal discussion on the way to address practically every single thing. So I feel very comfortable that this is the way I am working today in my team. And I know that we are able to spend more time to make sure, because some of the domains can be really sensitive. But for instance, making sure that your model generalizes a lot it's a good thing for the model itself and for the final product. We don't want it to just memorize data. That's not what we want. So that's an example. You do normalization on as much entities as you want. And for instance, if anybody heard my speech before about creating a terrorist incident detector, you might be able to give the same importance to every terrorist incident happening, no matter in which part of the world. You can do that. You do. That's one practical example, right? But there can be so many. It doesn't need to be that hard.
Can I also add something? I mean, if you have a startup, then you want to sell, don't you? Now, you guys, you create stuff that you want to sell. But if you sell it to a company, the company has got legal obligations already. I mean, there is already anti-discrimination law. You can't discriminate. That's clear. That's out there already. So why don't you take up the challenge and say, I'm going, in developing my systems, I'm going to adopt a privacy and ethics by design, and then I'm going to market and say, you are safe with me. Why don't you embrace this challenge instead of really worry about it? Because I understand, you know, you don't want to stifle your processes, your thinking, your creativity. But it's the other way around. It's going to a company and saying, you know, I'm at the forefront of this. If you purchase this product, we'll work together, and I'll make sure that you're not going to have, for as much as possible, issues around discrimination or stuff like that, which ultimately lead to massive liability costs.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
it's a challenge to really embrace, not to shy away from.
So what would you say is I mean, and I guess I'm broadly asking the panel here, to the extent that there's a massive liability cost, what's a good, like, scary example you can pull out of your pocket and say, all right, look at that incident, that was a bad one?
Well, let's say, for example, let's say, I mean, at the moment, you can use artificial intelligence or big data to predict and to say, for example, if somebody's going to jail and for how long somebody's going to jail. That's massive decisions that you can do. It's life-changing. It's life-changing. Or you can have systems deciding, for example, whether you can have access to a home, whether you can receive a loan or not. I mean, somebody may take you up on that, especially because now you have Article 22 in the GDPR. So somebody may say, I want to know why I am receiving this kind of response. Even in dynamic pricing, you can be in breach of the new consumer directive if, for example, you don't tell somebody how their price is the result of sort of personalized and dynamic pricing.
So I think, Markus, you're trying to.
Yeah, so I think we also have cases where like, you know, even if I'm a company and all I want is money, like there are also like good examples of sort of reputational risks, etc. I think maybe that's what you were getting at. That are like big enough so that you really want to pay attention to these things. Maybe one good example is Amazon, who had this case where they were training an algorithm to do CV screening for them for their engineering positions. It turns out that this algorithm sort of tended to just choose male candidates, and this just like became like a huge scandal and was like really bad in terms of their reputation, and is something that they will sort of live with for a long time. This would be like a go-to example for a lot of people, and so them having spent that extra, I don't know, 50% more time would have probably been like worth it.
Mikio.
Yeah, so I'm thinking. I mean, for me, I think the sort of the biggest problem is that we're reading too much intelligence into most of these algorithms, right? So I think and one example I always thinking about is like the accidents we had with the Tesla cars, right? Where it turns out they did the analysis and then there was something, I don't know, the car was driving towards the sun, suddenly everything was white and the thing thought, okay, the truck is actually a sign, or I don't know exactly what the specifics are, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if you read these things, it becomes very, very clear that these things, they just don't work as we do, and sort of all the safeguards that we think normally the systems have just don't apply, right? I think this is sort of the big blind spot when it comes to everything. So I think this is a very good example. So the danger is we read too much into these things, and I think there are clear examples that show that these things work in a completely different way.
My favorite joke is, don't anthropomorphize computers, they hate it. But it's a very narrow audience. So I guess, so the reason I'm pushing this point, and I guess I'm trying deliberately to make you upset, I guess, partly, is, but part of it is that, like, as a somewhat, as sort of, I guess I don't know why I've become more cynical maybe over time, but these mechanisms that are at work in companies and be it startups or large companies or even public organizations. Like, I've been through it enough sitting there with a purchasing person that is pushing the price, and like they have their margins, and like those moments is when truth really becomes clear in terms of what people's priorities are. It's like, do they actually care if this is safe, or are they just worried about getting there first and being cheaper or whatever? So again, like, what are, because in Sweden there's fairly limited regulation as far as I'm aware of AI. Like, there's basically none except for GDPR. There's no national legislation much. What are examples? So GDPR to me is still kind of abstract, to be honest. Like, what are good examples of pointed legislation that it serves to regulate specific things in the AI business that you know of?
Well, legislation is so. I mean, the GDPR does help. I know we see it as abstract, but it does help because there are two things in the GDPR. One is Article 22, which basically says you have to offer some degree of information about how a decision is being made. Yeah, so to an extent, if let's say a local authority in Sweden decides to make a decision using on access to benefit, for example, based by a machine, then they have to comply with Article 22. They have to be able to say, if they go with a company that provides the service, say, you have to offer some degree of explainability. Then, yeah. The other big thing, which is far greater, I think, than Article 22 and explainability, which in practice to me doesn't mean much, was far greater, is the information rights. So you as an individual, you have the right to access. So you can say, for example, I want to know information that you have about me, and that applies also to your data being used to train a machine. But also you have the right to say, I want to have my data raised, which also applies to sort of the data that is being used by an algorithm. So you do have the GDPR, which is there, but you have a full range of legislation. You have anti-discrimination law. It's there. So a public sector organization and a private sector organization, they will have to comply with that already. And if they don't, they're in breach of the law. And the other thing is, this is like, you say an organization, one big thing that I think after the Google that we've seen the other day, but also after what happened over the last few years with Amazon workers saying, tech workers saying, don't use recognition because it's not accurate, which is the facial recognition software. After Google did a massive book out because they were trying to silence sexual harassment, what we've seen is that people in your profession, they're really stepping it up. They're really stepping it up. And this is so important. So, for example, you were asking for practical solutions before. Why in a country like Sweden, when you have bargaining powers and you have a really solid public culture, for example, having tech workers involved in, for example, tech boards or ethics boards, that, to me, is the way that you as a country should be leading. And say, for example, we would like to have tech workers on company ethics boards and show the country that we can do better than Google.
I think politically we've been busy with other things recently, but you're right.
But that's sure, in Britain as well, don't worry. Yeah. There seems to be everywhere right now. But that is an interesting perspective in terms of a way that you can turn ethics into practice, because you can really make your profession key into this.
Yeah. So, Danila, I wanted to check with you. So let's say we form these ethics boards in companies. There's obviously some sort of line between good and bad AI applications. Do you have sort of any takes on how to decide where that line goes in your life or in your view, sort of?
Well, first of all, ethic boards in companies, and also make sure that they are connected, because everybody can have a different meter, like of what is discriminatory or not. Second, I am not sure how to answer this question, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I thought there are so many ways in which AI can create bias that I really want to enforce. For instance, when it can replace a biased human being. So if we are talking about automatic resume review, I'm really not happy if that system that judges me because I'm a woman or because of my age, for instance. But if we created a great unbiased automatic resume review system that will take into account my competence and will put me in the same group of people like me in the right way, then maybe I don't want to go through interviews with a human which is biased. But of course, this is
Maybe there will be a law in the future enforcing only robotic CV selection.
And that is exactly what I didn't want to say, but because that's the point. I don't have a final answer. There are so many bad applications that I can think of, but there are all the ones that harm people.
So with the risk of massively overrunning on time here, I guess there's one aspect of ethics here that we have been missing, in my opinion, and we've talked a lot about bias and sort of accountability and who holds responsibility. So those are sort of product-oriented things where someone is selling something or delivering something or doing something. A much broader question, I guess, is sort of what does automation do to our labor force and redistribution of wealth and so forth? So that seems like a much bigger ethics question, but it boils down to AI, where sort of digital goods promise to have to democratize knowledge and to spread wealth, and instead, I guess, those who already knew a lot know a lot more, and those who had money now have even more of it. So what's your take on this, this sort of, the future of that aspect of AI and automation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's one of the really big challenges, and maybe one of the bigger challenges that we need to figure out as a society going forward. In general, I guess there are two things people worry about. One is the sort of mass unemployment type stuff, or whether you'll see increase in unemployment because of automation. Economists are still debating this. Mainly, they're debating this question of will this technology be like a complement or a substitute of human labor? It seems like there's sort of some disagreement about whether automation currently is becoming a substitute or not. But going forward, if you look
pretty wonky framing to remember they are engineers.
That's true.
So
Okay. So you're trying to figure out does the system just make me more productive? Does it make me do my job better, or does it replace me?
Right.
And so the analogy people often draw is to to horses. And so there was a long time where horses we sort of developed new technologies that were a complement to their labor. So they became more productive. They could move more people because you added a carriage, etc. And maybe there could be several horses that would drag one big thing.
Doesn't that seem kind of true? It's not like my iPad makes me work less. I would say it makes me work more.
Yeah. So I think it's plausible that right now we're in a state where we're complementing human labor, i.e. We're becoming more productive, better workers because of technology. But perhaps you might see that at some point you'll shift over to the substitution stage where we're being replaced instead. And so in the horse case, this was when you've invented a carriage that had a horse inside of it, i.e. a motor, and that turned out to be something that could substitute the horse. And maybe we'll see. I think there are good reasons to see that if technology continues to develop really well, sort of the human judgment and those kinds of things can also be
flexible
replaced.
abstractions. You go from complement to horse inside car.
Exactly.
All right.
I'm actually quite looking forward to a little bit of shake-up in the market. And the reason why I'm saying for this is because I'm going to be quite polemical now. You've called for it. So
I think we've gotten off to a good start.
So I'm going to mention the word Donald Trump. Donald Trump said, I'm never going to be driven by a computer. Yeah? Why did Donald Trump say that? He always has a go at artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation because the power base that Donald Trump has is the white working class. And those are the ones that, according to public wisdom, are the ones whose jobs are most at risks. Yeah? So that's Trump. Salvini in Italy says exactly the same. Right? What I'm saying, why am I saying this here before? Why am I saying this for? Because you are operating in a sector, machine learning, which is much more than technology. It's much more than that. Because true, some jobs are going to be replaced.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing right now is scaremongering. What we're seeing at the moment is the narrative in the media is going to show us that all jobs are going to be replaced. And then you've got Donald Trump standing up for his power base. And then there's a lot of populism underpinning this, right? And we've got to be careful, because reality is, first of all, it's not going to happen overnight. Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not happening. Second, a lot of new jobs are going to be created. Third is, we are going to go through some turmoil, but we're already going through turmoil everywhere. I mean, populism is everywhere because a lot of people are losing their jobs. So we need policy solutions, universal basic income, whatever it is, we need policy solution. But the last thing is, embrace the positive side of it, which could be great. It could reshape the way that we live, the way that even gender relationships are. If we shake up society a little bit, it's not going to be a bad thing. So what I'm saying is, AI is much more than technology. There is something really much deeper going on in the world around this. And we have to be careful to really see things with the right lens. And you are in a privileged position as programmers, as coders, to do that, because you really see it. And not let others, from Trump to the media, setting out the narrative around what the future is going to look like.
Thank you very much. So I guess I figured we'd round it off sort of with just having everyone choose what they think is, like, I'm obviously, this is from a wide menu of things you can pick, but like, what is the one thing you would tell people to do today to make the situation better with respect to AI and ethics? Like, if you had to pick one thing, and we'll do all of you, but be brief, please, because we need coffee.
I think for me, the most important thing is to really be realistic about where the technology is right now, right? And I think that would already help and make sure more people understand where we are really.
Markus, what is your take? What's your pick?
I think my take is something like, maybe this isn't advice for like all of the people, but I'm like super excited about like growing the field of people who are thinking really, really carefully and deeply about how we're going to like manage this transition or how we're going to develop this technology going forward. And so if I just like tell everyone to like go and read and learn about the things, then hopefully a few of you will go on to do amazing things. And I'd be super excited about that.
Cool. Always be recruiting. Ivana.
Talk to your friends. Tell everyone what you do. Just say to everyone what you do, what the possibilities are, and because people need to understand what's the power underpinning on this. So talk to everybody. And the last thing is, if you see a young woman, tell her to go into AI, coding, and tech, because that's really important.
Danila, you get to have last word.
Yeah, be thoughtful about what to do, and make an effort. Take that extra step that takes you to deliver what you really want.
I think you're a good role model for that, and I want us all to give a round of applause for our panel.